I don't want to set the world on fire. I just want to start a flame in your heart.
Hello, and we welcome you to the Cold War exhibit. Please pay attention to the following video for information about the exhibits and their history. Good luck.
The United Nations was an improved version of the League of Nations that would be used to arbitrate international conflict and negotiate peace. When its principles were decided on at the San Francisco Conference, world leaders agreed that its core principles would focus on self-determination and equal rights for all people. Its most influential members were part of the Security Council, including the US, Soviet Union, China, France, and Britain. These nations could not prohibit discussion of any topic, but could veto any proposals.
With the decolonization of many colonies, there was a rise in independent governments. These newly independent nations would be given votes in the UN, as would all nations. So there was another battle between the Soviets and the Americans. This battle was to win the UN majority by influencing newly formed countries into capitalist countries rather than communist countries. Two major points of this battle were in Vietnam, where the communist regime rebelled against France, and in Cuba, where Fidel Castro overthrew Batista and began creating several treaties with the Soviets, angering the US. Though there is no clear beginning to the Cold War, there are many different events that may have led to the Cold War. One major factor in the beginning of the Cold War was the Potsdam Conference of 1945. In this conference, there was an atmosphere of tension between the United States and the Soviet Union. The two nations had very different views on how to handle Germany after the war ended. While the Soviets wanted Germany to pay heavy reparations, the United States did not wish to have a reparations fiasco because of the economic downfall it helped to cause after World War I. Another huge factor was the existence of the power vacuum after World War II. With Britain, Japan, Germany, and France all severely crippled, the US and the USSR stepped into that spot of power. This caused tension and ultimately a war of innovation and ideas, a war of espionage and spies, a war of capitalism and communism.
George Kennan was the American diplomat in Russia. He sent a telegram to the US as Mr. X, concluding that US policy towards the Soviet Union should be firm, vigilant, and aware of the Russians' ambition for expansion. Kennan advocated the containment policy utilized by the Truman administration to contain any further communist expansion. Winston Churchill extended this argument by presenting his speech, The Sinews of Peace, on March 5, 1946, about the Soviet-built Iron Curtain, which cut off the Eastern European countries from the West, and a closer relationship between the United States and Great Britain. This speech was set to signal the opening of the Cold War and change the way the democratic West viewed the communist East. The situation in 1947 was such that the British needed American help in Greece to defend their government against the leftists. As a result, Truman delivered a speech to Congress on March 12, 1947, asking for $400 million in aid to Greece and Turkey and the dispatch of American civilian and military personnel to these regions. This action implied the creation of what is known as the Truman Doctrine. the belief that the United States would provide political, military, and economic assistance to all democratic nations threatened by authoritarian forces. This signaled a critical change in U.S. foreign policy as the U.S. began to intervene in European conflicts as opposed to isolating itself from conflicts not involving the U.S. Truman asserted that the U.S. could no longer allow the Soviet Union's expansion into free, independent, and capitalist nations.
The National Security Act. The National Security Act was established on the July of 1947 and created many different and effective organizations designed to keep America protected from others. The list included the Office of Secretary of Defense to oversee all branches of armed forces, the National Security Council, a collection of high-level officials to advise the President, and the Central Intelligence Agency to conduct spy operations and intervene in foreign affairs. The CIA also began the President's bag of dirty tricks regarding its unorthodox ways of getting the things that the nation wanted.
To aid in the fortification of U.S. defense, President Truman worked with Congress to create the National Security Act. This act led to the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency, which was developed to conduct spy operations and information gathering overseas. This branch was later expanded in the 1950s to include covert operations aimed at overthrowing unfriendly foreign leaders and to stir up economic problems with the enemy. This government program gave the president even more power when it came to foreign affairs.
The Marshall Plan served as a European recovery program that aimed to prevent the spread of communism and stimulate business at home. It required that Europeans spend the $13 billion foreign aid dollars in the U.S. on American products. Though it stimulated Western European industrial production, it caused inflation, failed to solve a balance of payments problem, and further divided Europe into East and West.
To try and remedy the German problem, the French, British, and Americans agreed to combine their three sectors in Berlin. They hoped this would integrate Western Germany into the Western European economy. However, Stalin, fearing a resurgent Germany, blockaded all Western land access from Berlin. In response to this, Truman ordered a successful airlift of food and supplies to Berlin, causing a boost in his political career and an end to the Soviet blockade in May of 1949. As a result of this political boost, Truman narrowly won the 1948 election against Republican Thomas E. Dewey.
The fall of China. While the US was trying to contain communism throughout the world, they did not have as much success in China. Before World War II, the US supported Jiang Jiechi against Communist Mao Zedong. However, after the war, Jiang rejected and disobeyed US advice. The government under Jiang was corrupt and inefficient. However, the United States continued supporting Jiang because he was still better than a communist Mao. America was divided on whether to believe that Mao was a puppet of the Soviet Union or to believe that he was an Asian-Taito communist but independent. However, most believed he was part of the international communist movement that might give the Soviet Union a springboard into Asia. For this reason, America rejected Chinese communists when they made secret overtures to the US to begin diplomatic talks in 1945 and 1949. During the Cold War, Mao sided with the Soviet Union, though he resented their refusal to aid communists during the Civil War. In September 1949, Jiang fled to Taiwan, and in Beijing, Mao declared victory and proclaimed People's Republic of China. Truman hesitated to extend diplomatic recognition to the new communist government. United States officials were alarmed by the 1950 Sino-Soviet Treaty of Friendship and the harassment of Americans and their property in China. Truman also chose non-recognition of the PRC because of a vocal group of Republican critics, the Chinese lobby, who were winning headlines by asking the question, "Who lost China?" Publisher Henry Luce, Senator William Nolan of California, and Representative Walter Jude of Minnesota all pinned Mao's defeat on Truman.
Following World War II, Korea was taken from Japan and split into two countries, Communist North Korea, which was armed by the Soviets, and Capitalist South Korea, which was armed by the US. On June 25, 1950, North Korea, led by Kim Il-sung, moved across the 38th parallel into South Korea, led by Syngman Rhee. Truman immediately ordered General Douglas MacArthur to send arms and troops to South Korea without seeking congressional approval. The Security Council of the UN voted to assist South Korea, and, as a result, MacArthur became commander of the UN forces in Korea. In the early weeks of the war, the North Korean military pushed the South Koreans and Americans into the Pusan perimeter at the top of South Korea. To counterattack, MacArthur planned a bold operation to amphibiously land on and attack the heavily fortified Incheon, several hundred miles behind the North Korean lines. The operation was successful, and the troops were able to liberate the South Korean capital of Seoul. Soon afterwards, they pushed the North Koreans back to the 38th parallel. However, Truman's war goal hadn't been accomplished, reunification of Korea by force. American and UN troops pushed north towards the Yalu River. China threatened to attack if the South Korean forces pushed further. China soon enters the war and pushed the US and UN troops back to the 38th parallel. The Korean front stabilized in early 1951, and both the US and Soviet Union were willing to start peace negotiations. General MacArthur was not satisfied with this peace. He wanted to give up limited war and destroy China using atomic bombs. Due to this disrespect, MacArthur was fired by Truman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff in April 1951. Similar to the Korean War, in which there was no formal declaration of war by Congress, the Vietnam War occurred primarily in the 1960s and 1970s. This long, costly battle pitted North Vietnam and the communist Viet Cong against South Vietnam and the United States.
The Suez Crisis ensued after Egypt's president Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. As a result, Britain, France, and Israel decided to send troops to regain control in the region. This joint attack was executed without the United States' permission, and the US later demanded its allies withdraw in order to prevent Soviet intervention in the Middle East.
To ensure the safety of capitalism in developing nations, drastic measures had to have been taken. The Eisenhower Doctrine, announced in January of 1957 by President Dwight Eisenhower, stated that the U.S. Army would help any country that required help in fighting a communist takeover. This doctrine was passed due to increased hostility in the Middle East, as well as a power vacuum in this region, due to the lack of French and British influence.
In 1957, the Soviet Union successfully launched Sputnik 1, the world's first Earth-orbiting satellite. Though the Sputnik was only about the size of a basketball, its launch was enough to catch the American public off guard because people feared the Soviets could be capable of launching ballistic missiles that could carry nuclear weapons to the US. The Sputnik launch also marked the start of the space age and the US-USSR space race. As a result, President Eisenhower established the NASA, National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Additionally, Congress passed the National Defense Education Act, which expanded federal aid to education by funding programs in mathematics, foreign languages, and the sciences. In the U-2 spy incident of 1960, the Soviet Union shot down the American U-2 spy plane flown by Francis Gary Powers. At first, President Eisenhower denied, but was later forced to admit that the US had been spying on the Soviet Union through the CIA for many years. This incident came just before the Paris summit meeting where the leaders would discuss nuclear arms production. Though Powers was sentenced to prison, he was eventually released after the US captured a Soviet agent and conducted the first US-USSR spy swap.
This ends the introduction to the Cold War exhibit. Please have a look around and come again.